send this before the wedding," Sarah said casually, as if she was asking me to pass the salt instead of signing away rights I didn't even know were at stake. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. This wasn't how I'd imagined our romantic dinner ending. The prenup hit the table between our entrees like a grenade with the pin pulled. Flipping through the pages, my stomach dropped. The numbers didn't make sense. Sarah, my fiancée who complained about her student loans and drove a 10-year-old Honda, apparently had a $2 million trust fund, rental properties, and investment portfolios I'd never heard a whisper about. 3 years together and she'd been playing broke the entire time. "Why hide this from me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Sarah's confident mask cracked. "I needed to know it was real, that you love me, not my bank account," she whispered. "But my family's lawyer says I'm being naive." Suddenly I understood this wasn't about the money. It was about whether she'd choose their fear or our trust. I slid the folder back across the table. "I'm not signing tonight. Not out of greed. I need my own lawyer to review this. But more importantly, we need to talk about 3 years of lies before we talk about legally protecting assets I didn't know existed." I pulled out my phone, adding a reminder, "Find attorney tomorrow." If Sarah wanted protection, fine, but I needed answers first. I sat across from Margot Reynolds in the sterile conference room, her designer pen clicking rhythmically as she reviewed the prenuptial agreement one final time. Sarah squeezed my hand beneath the table, her eyes glistening with what I assumed was gratitude for my cooperation. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that just 72 hours earlier, I'd received a certified letter informing me that Uncle Charles had left me his entire estate, 4.7 million, 3 rental properties, and a portfolio of investments that would change everything. But I kept my mouth shut, and today, I would sign away rights to assets I'd never even mentioned. As Margot slid the papers toward me with a satisfied smile, explaining how the prenup protected Sarah's family business and her trust fund from any potential claims I might make, I couldn't help but notice the one-sided nature of the document. It meticulously outlined how I'd have no claim to anything Sarah brought into the marriage or earned during it. But there wasn't a single clause about my assets, because as far as they knew, a high school English teacher living paycheck to paycheck had nothing worth protecting. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah's lawyer had crafted the perfect shield for the wrong person. Uncle Charles's fortune sat in probate, completely invisible to this process, and the inheritance wouldn't be finalized for another week, conveniently after our wedding date. "Ethan, I just want you to know how much this means to me," Sarah whispered as I held the pen over the signature line. "Most guys would be offended by this, but you understand that I have to protect what my family built. It shows you really love me for me, not for what I have." Her words hit differently than she intended. In that moment, I realized she'd asked for this prenup not out of genuine concerns, but because her mother had insisted, because they'd always seen me as the lesser partner, someone who needed to be kept at arm's length from their wealth. As I signed my name with a flourish, I made a decision I wouldn't tell Sarah about the inheritance until after the wedding. If she could question my intentions based on her assets, then I deserved to know whether she'd married me for love or because she thought I was safely beneath her social class. I played the role of the understanding, slightly grateful fiancé perfectly. I smiled warmly at Margot, thanked her for being so fair about everything, and even made a self-deprecating joke about how my teacher's salary probably wouldn't buy what Sarah spent on shoes anyway. Sarah laughed relieved, and her mother, who'd been lurking near the doorway, actually smiled at me for the first time in months. My strategy was simple: let them underestimate me completely. I'd document everything, keep the inheritance quiet through the wedding, and see how our marriage unfolded when Sarah believed she held all the cards. If she treated me as an equal partner, respected me despite thinking I had nothing, then maybe the prenup wouldn't matter. But if the power imbalance she'd built into our relationship revealed something uglier, well, Uncle Charles had just given me options I'd never had before. For now I'd wait and see exactly who I was really marrying. Chapter Hidden Fortunes. I still remember the exact moment my hands stopped shaking after reading Uncle Charles's will, not from grief, though that came later, but from the sheer impossibility of the numbers staring back at me from the attorney's letter. While Sarah spent weeks planning our modest wedding on our combined teacher salaries, I sat in my empty apartment each night staring at bank statements that showed more zeros than I'd earned in 3 lifetimes, unable to tell her that everything had changed. The weight of the secret grew heavier when Sarah's frustration about our finances reached a breaking point one evening, her voice cracking as she suggested we might need to postpone the wedding. And I realized my silence was no longer protecting her, but deceiving her. I decided to wait until after our parents' dinner next week to review the inheritance, convincing myself that understanding Uncle Charles's legacy first, why he'd lived so humbly despite his wealth, would help me explain to Sarah why I'd kept this from her, though deep down I knew I was just buying time to reconcile my own guilt about the money while my uncle's body was barely cold. The champagne sat untouched on the bedside table as I finally said the words I'd been rehearsing for weeks. "Sarah, there's something about my Uncle Charles's estate I need to tell you." The way her smile froze on her face told me she sensed this wasn't going to be the romantic conversation she'd expected on our wedding night. When I explained that Uncle Charles hadn't just left me his house but a 47 million portfolio of investments and properties, Sarah's face went through a series of transformations I'll never forget. First disbelief, then confusion, then something that looked almost like betrayal. "You let me think we're just a struggling teacher," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You let me insist on that prenup protecting my assets while you were worth 50 times what I am." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She'd spent months convincing me that her family's money needed protection from my modest teacher's salary. What happened next still plays in my mind like a slow-motion film. Sarah lunged for her purse where she'd tucked her copy of the prenup after the ceremony, her hands trembling as she tried to rip it apart. "This doesn't count! You lied! You manipulated me!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. I watched as the woman I'd married just hours ago clawed at the pages, her carefully manicured nails leaving deep scratches across the legal text. The document didn't tear, it was printed on heavy legal stock, but watching her try felt like watching our entire relationship shred apart. The desperation in her eyes wasn't grief, it was rage at a deal she now considered unfair. I stayed completely still, letting her exhaust herself against the reality of signed legal documents and witnessed signatures. When she finally collapsed onto the bed sobbing, I spoke quietly but firmly. "I never lied, Sarah. You never asked. You assumed. And you built an entire prenup around protecting yourself from someone you saw as beneath you financially." I didn't tell her about the second copy stored with my lawyer, or that the prenup was ironclad regardless of what she did to that paper. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, understanding that whatever happened next would define not just our marriage, but who we both really were. The legal notice hit my doorstep like a bomb. "Challenge to prenuptial agreement," screamed from the letterhead. Sarah's lawyer, Margot Reynolds, was coming for me fast and hard. Margot wasn't claiming the prenup was invalid, she was accusing me of hiding Uncle Charles' true fortune during negotiations. She painted me as a schemer who deliberately deceived Sarah about the inheritance's size. The kicker, I didn't even know the full amount myself when we signed. My lawyer David Chen dropped the hammer. "They're attacking your character, not just the contract. If the judge believes you acted in bad faith, portions of the prenup could fall apart." This wasn't about money anymore, it was about destroying my reputation as leverage. I chose facts over drama. No public statements, no emotional warfare, just documentation. Every email, bank record, and timeline proving when I learned about the inheritance would speak for itself. While Sarah and Margot built their emotional narrative, I built an evidence fortress. Truth doesn't need theatrics. The morning after I refused to sign the prenup, I woke to find Sarah's side of the bed cold and empty. Her coffee mug sat unwashed in the sink, a small act of defiance that told me everything had changed overnight. Going through the prenup one more time with my own lawyer, I discovered a clause buried on page 17 that Sarah's lawyer Margot had conveniently glossed over. If we divorced within 5 years, Sarah would retain controlling interest in any marital investments, including my inherited assets if they were commingled with joint accounts. She wasn't just after half, she was positioning herself to control it all. Sarah finally broke her 3-day silence with a text that read, "We need to talk. Come to Margot's office at 4 p.m. Not a request to meet at home, not a conversation between partners, but a summons to her lawyer's territory." That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with my fiancée anymore. I was dealing with an adversary. I called my own lawyer and had her join me at Margot's office. When Sarah's face fell at seeing I'd brought representation, I knew I'd made the right call. I calmly stated my position: I would marry her with a fair prenup that protected both of us equally, or not at all. No ultimatums, no hidden clauses, no games. I also moved Uncle Charles's inheritance into a separate trust that afternoon. Something I should have done from the start. Sometimes the red flags are only clear in hindsight, but once you see them, you can't unsee them. The ink on the divorce papers was still wet when Sarah's lawyer called me for the 3rd time that week. "Mystery Harper. My client is willing to settle for 40% if we can avoid court." I stared at the prenup sitting on my desk, the one she'd mocked as unromantic, and smiled for the first time in days. During our final mediation, Margot Reynolds presented evidence that I'd hidden assets before the marriage, but when she opened the folder, her face went white. Someone had sent her copies of texts between Sarah and an old boyfriend, messages dated during our engagement, discussing how she'd secured the bag, and planning their reunion, once the dust settled. Sarah hadn't just married me for money, she'd never ended her other relationship. The mediator if I wanted to pursue legal action for fraud. I looked at Sarah, mascara running, designer handbag clutched tight, and realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore, I was grateful. This whole disaster had shown me exactly who she was, and more importantly what Uncle Charles had really given me: not just money, but the freedom to see people's true intentions clearly. "No," I told the mediator. "The prenup stands. We're done here." I returned to teaching the following Monday, deliberately choosing the same worn jacket I'd worn before the inheritance. Word had spread through our social circle about the divorce, and I could feel the stares. Rather than hide, I addressed it head on with my students during homeroom. "Sometimes the universe gives you a test disguised as a gift," I told them. "The real wealth is knowing the difference between what glitters and what's actually gold." I donated a significant portion of Uncle Charles's money to establish a financial literacy program at the school, teaching kids what I'd learned the hard way about protecting yourself and reading people's motivations. The first day back in my classroom felt surreal, standing at the front of 30 expectant faces, chalk dust settling on my blazer, pretending the past 6 months hadn't completely shattered and rebuilt me. I'd walked away from $4 million and the woman I thought I'd marry. Now, staring at my meticulously organized lesson plans, I wondered if anyone could see the cracks still running through me. 3 weeks into the semester, I received an unmarked envelope in my faculty mailbox. Inside was a cashier's check for $47, the exact amount Sarah had borrowed for her supposed business investment. No note, no explanation, just the money as cold and impersonal as a transaction receipt. Later that evening, Margot called. Sarah's filed for bankruptcy, she said carefully. Her company collapsed. She's settling debts before the courts freeze everything. The money wasn't an apology, it was legal housekeeping. The revelation stung differently than I expected, not because she'd returned it, but because even this gesture had nothing to do with remorse. That check sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I made my decision. Instead of depositing it into my personal account, I contacted a financial advisor and established something I called the Charles Harper Scholarship Fund, named after my uncle, funded by the money that had nearly destroyed me. The fund would support students from working-class backgrounds pursuing teaching degrees. As I signed the paperwork, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't running from the inheritance anymore, and I wasn't letting it consume me. For the first time, I was using money as a tool, not a weapon or a cure-all. I threw myself into a deliberate pattern of reconstruction. Morning, teach with the same passion I'd had before Uncle Charles died. Afternoon, meet with my financial advisor to learn about index funds, municipal bonds, and compound interest. The boring, reliable foundations I should have built from the beginning. Evening, therapy sessions where I unpacked not just Sarah's betrayal, but my own complicity in ignoring every red flag. I started a journal titled, Red Flags I'll Never Miss Again, filling it with painful lessons about intention versus affection. I learned to ask better questions, not, does this person love me? But does this person's behavior match their words over time? I rebuilt my life brick by brick, this time checking each brick's integrity before laying it down.